So what we've been discussing up to this point is really the gender of politics. But there's also a politics of gender. And in the politics of gender, we're talking about gender issues, not necessarily the overall structural form that might be masculine. But now we're talking about the actual issues of governing that relate to gender. Things like reproductive rights, work and family balance, fertility. All of these things play out in the political arena. And when the structure of the political institutions themselves are masculine, and those individuals within the structure of the political arena start making decisions about your life, especially gendered decisions that impact the women of the world, it can have some serious consequences. Take, for example, personal decisions like fertility. Fertility is an assessment of how many children you might individually decide to have. And that has an enormous political and economic implication. These decisions will affect the educational system and the number of people entering the workplace, which also affects the money that people leaving the workplace due to retirement will be able to have. It affects the healthcare system. Too many children will put a burden on the educational and healthcare system, but will eventually help raise the money needed to fund Social Security and Medicare. Too few children eases the burden on the educational and healthcare systems, but will eventually drive the funds that feed Social Security and Medicare. Clearly, fertility is a complicated issue. Other things like healthcare coverage and birth control, decisions made on birth control and what's covered under a healthcare plan that are specifically related to women was ultimately decided by a panel that consisted of only men. This was essentially reaffirmed recently in the Republicans' attempt to reform the Affordable Care Act. It's commemorated in a picture at the beginning of this or not this chapter, but the beginning of this section, where there's a number of white men that have just recently tried to decide what women should get in reference to healthcare benefits. Of course, family-friendly workplaces. The U.S. offers no paid parental leave. Once again, we sit at the bottom of a category that we should be uncomfortable with. We are one of the few Western industrialized nations that provide very little for families that are having children. And then this is constructed as a gender issue, but it really should not be a gender issue. It should not be a woman's issue. It should be a family issue. And then, of course, those from the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, queer community are particularly targeted. Transgender discrimination is more rampant than gender discrimination, and gender discrimination is pretty severe. So the politics of gender are in many respects more important than the gender of politics itself. So not only do gender issues show up constantly on the political agenda, but the political arena is itself a gendered and gendering institution. Once again, it's masculine. You have to be a fighter. You have to be prepared for the rigors of the strenuous challenge, the long overworked days, the heavy weight of the political decisions, which of course we've structured women incapable of accomplishing. The state itself has to be seen as a gendered institution. As I said, the timing of career clocks versus the childbearing years. Women's most productive years are also their most productive childbearing years. And if they choose childbearing, then they ultimately pull themselves out of the ladder to success, and it's hard to get back in and make up that ground. Of course, when we think about what the state is, originally citizens were supposed to be men. All men are created equal. We've now interpreted that as all people are created equal. Now, we can argue about whether all people are treated equal in our society or not, but at least the documents would support that position. Globalization itself, the economic institutions and framework that takes the place of the development project in the mid-1990s, where companies are allowed to be uprooted and move around the landscape. And I mean the landscape being moving from the United States to Mexico or Indonesia or China, places where the regulations and the cost of development are less. Of course, this privileges men. If you look at corporate boards across the economic landscape, you see about 92% of the people that sit on boards are men. There is a glass ceiling in many respects in reference to those who get to be the captains of industry. The global model of corporation is one that is of a masculine form, aggressive, willing to do what it takes, willing to make the hard decisions, even if the hard decisions are going to wipe out groups of people or destroy ecosystems. We have to remember that globalization is gendered as well as economic integration has differential impacts on women and men. At the national and global levels, the world gender order privileges men in a variety of ways, such as unequal wages, unequal labor force participation, unequal structures of ownership and control of property, unequal control over one's body, and cultural and sexual privileges. On the other hand, traditional notions of male breadwinners and female homemakers have created two large migrant populations, one of mothers who leave their children behind to care for other people's children, and one of fathers who leave their families behind to seek manual work in other countries, often living in squatter camps and all-male dormitories on factory grounds. And when we think about this global corporate masculinity, it certainly has a color and it has a gender. You can envision this dominant global masculinity. He's white, middle-aged, sitting in the business class lounge in any international hub airport. Regardless of his national origin, he speaks English fluently. He is cosmopolitan in his cultural style. He loves continental cuisine and good wines. He is the global 1%. Yet he is so ubiquitous in our newspapers, magazines, and TV shows that it is often hard to remember that there are very few people in the world like him. Racism plays a key component in oppression. And colonialism has always had a color. And that color was white. Many of the social movements that have risen up to push back against these institutions, they've either been progressive or they've been radical and fundamentalist. Some women have been imprisoned within the traditional society constraints and then further subordinated by the colonial intervention. This is very much the case in places like Iran and Iraq. If you ask someone if they want gender equality, that's a loaded term. An Egyptian woman might ask you, do you mean all women should be like men? And if that's the case, then the answer is no. But if you mean women have choice and equal protection under the law, most would say yes. On the other hand, you might have a conservative and fundamentalist movement that seeks to restore the society to its traditional foundations, also seeking to transform gender relations, but in exactly the opposite direction. The Taliban, for example, sought to remove women from all public life and return them to the home where they argued women belong. All across the Islamic world, but particularly in Iran and Iraq, women had made enormous strides towards equality, asserting rights to go to school and even universities, to enter professions, and to choose their husbands. These traditional movements have tried to put a stop to this, pushing women out of the labor force and closing girls out of schools. At the same time, these movements reassert men's dominance in the home, insisting that women obey their fathers and husbands and punishing them often brutally or even lethally when they resist. This brings us to the idea that the personal is political and that the political is personal. When we say that the personal is political, what we mean by that is that the daily routines of personal life, housework, raising children, negotiating activities with your partners and your friends, and what TV and movies you watched, what music you listened to, even sex, were political, utterly entwined with the political realities of gender inequality. And they were embedded in your daily life. Every day reflected and reproduced both gender difference and gender inequality. But it's equally true that the political is personal, or that the arena of the political, from policy decisions to the choices you have about voting in elections, all reflect the gender differences we assume are natural and the gender inequalities we often believe flow inevitably from the natural differences. So as we see the rise of feminism, over time, feminism takes shape. You can think about it in reference to a first, second, and third wave. In the first wave of the movement, women are arguing that they're arguing for women their rights and nothing less, and men their rights and nothing more. So in this first wave, what we're seeing is women struggling for